Hi, good afternoon, everyone. So, beta, today we are going to talk about trends in inflation in India. हमने ऑलरेडी इस बारे में बात तो की है कि इंडिया में इन्फ्लेशन कैसे मेजर की जाती है, कंज्यूमर प्राइस इंडेक्स के थ्रू एंड होलसेल प्राइस इंडेक्स के थ्रू. वी हैव ऑलरेडी टॉक्ड अबाउट दैट, राइट? But today I want to focus on what have been the trends in inflation in India, right? माने over time since independence कैसे हमने देखा है inflation कैसा रहा है, right? So as I have told you in the last classes that earlier wholesale price index was used to measure the inflation in India. पहले हम WPI को ज्यादा यूज करते थे. And now consumer price index is used to measure inflation in India. अब हम CPI को ज्यादा यूज करते हैं. So that's the first thing, right? The second thing is that whenever we go ahead and whenever we talk about the inflation in India, we always look at something which is called as trend. Trend माने क्या बेटा? What's the meaning of trend? So just think about it. जैसे short run में I may see कि अच्छा last month inflation had increased, then inflation decreased, then inflation increased. We are not concerned with that कि last month क्या हुआ उसके comparison में इस month क्या हुआ. No, we don't look at it like that. What we go ahead and what we look at is basically how my inflation is going to go ahead and how my inflation is going to change with the long run perspective. Short run में क्या हो रहा है, I am not concerned with that. ठीक है. Long run में क्या होगा, I am more concerned with that. That is what I am concerned with. Is it making some sense? So I am not interested in understanding the short run perspective. I am interested in understanding the long run perspective. Okay. So, जैसे for example, if I look here, okay, inflation increased, inflation decreased, increased, decreased, increased, decreased, no problem. Decreased, decreased, increased, increased, decreased. कोई फर्क नहीं है. You try and pass a line through it. It is an upward sloping line, na? So the trend is upward. There is an upward trend in inflation. Does not matter what is happening in the short run. The trend is always long. समझ में आ रही है ये बात, what I am saying? हाँ. So we want to look into trend. Trend माने we want to look at the long run picture. I don't want to look on month on month basis and tell what is happening. I want to look in the long run perspective and see what is happening. Right? So please write down beta. Inflation in India is typically measured through consumer price index, and earlier it was more measured by wholesale price index, right? So from 1960 onwards, we have long-term data available on inflation. Long-term data. And this data is more reliable, right? So very reliable long-term data is available on inflation since 1960 onwards, right? For example, we have official consumer price index from 1960 onwards available. Okay. Now, if I find out the average inflation in India from 1960 to 2024, if I find out the average inflation in India, right, then this is 7.3%. Though average does not really mean anything to us. I mean, average of so many years, things have changed, perspectives have changed, the economies have changed. Average का बहुत ज़्यादा कुछ मतलब नहीं है, but still I'm just telling you that if I find the average, it's about 7.3%. अच्छा, now let's look at decade on decade basis. Decade. Now average will make sense क्योंकि हम पूरे पीरियड का एक साथ नहीं निकाल रहे हैं. Average and what have been the key features or causes. What have been the key features or causes, right? So the first one, I will also talk about period on period basis, but we will also do it, I mean, so there are two ways to look into it. मैं एक बार समझा देती हूँ. You can either say कि 1960s तक का एक पीरियड ले लो, till since independence till 1960s. फिर उसके बाद 1970s एक पीरियड ले लो, 1980s एक पीरियड ले लो, 1990s एंड अर्ली 2000 एक पीरियड ले लो. सो ईदर यू कैन डू दिस वे and divide broad inflation in 5 phases, or you can also go ahead and you can do in decade by decade basis. So 1950s alag, 60s alag, 70s alag, and so on and so forth. Up to you how you want to go about it. So I'm taking 1950s first, right? And the average was 1.7%, right? It was a very low inflation period, but it was also a period where we had just started growing. है ना? So we know if I look into, if I look into the cycle, business cycle, so we know that when we are in the period of recession or recovery, right, or depression or boom, every period also has varied prices. है ना? जैसे boom का period जो होगा, it will be having a lot of inflation in the economy. Recession के period में there will be deflation in the economy. So, there can be deflation and there can also be disinflation. I hope you know the difference between the two. The difference between disinflation and deflation. ठीक है. तो जब हम disinflation की बात करते हैं, so let me write this down separately. I'm just mentioning here. There is something called disinflation and something called deflation, right? So when we go ahead and when we talk about deflation, right? Deflation just is going ahead and is saying that your inflation is basically increasing at a decreasing rate, right? So basically what has happened in deflation, it is a general fall in the overall price level of the goods. Okay. Whereas when we talk about disinflation, right? Disinflation is basically when your inflation is not decreasing. Disinflation is when your inflation is increasing, but it is increasing at lower and lower amount, by lower and lower amount. So I think for deflation, you can go ahead and you can say that this is where inflation is falling. यहाँ पे भी inflation is falling, right? But the difference is that disinflation or deflation is when, or rather, inflation is not falling, the growth rate of inflation is falling. That would be the right statement to make here. So here, for example, if my inflation goes from 6% to 2%, माने price were increasing from 100 to 106, now price are increasing by lesser amount. So the increase in price has decreased. देखो यहाँ पे price increased by 6 units, then by 1 unit, then by 0.4 unit, then by 0.1 unit. So price are increasing. Inflation is there in the economy, but the growth of inflation is falling. right? So you notice it increased by a higher amount, for a little less amount, a little less amount, and a little less amount. On the other hand, when we talk about deflation, deflation is basically when the inflation is itself falling, not the growth, but inflation itself is falling, right? So deflation is basically a period where you have negative inflation. Huh? So जैसे if price went from 100 to 99, price decreased, then it is called as deflation. So deflation is when price increases, right? Disinflation or disflation is when inflation rate is decreasing, but it is positive. ठीक है? Is it clear? ठीक है. Coming back to what we were doing. So basically what we saw is that when we just got independence, जब हमें सिर्फ independence मिला ही था, the newly independent India, it had a very low amount of inflation in the economy because we were not in the period of boom. We were in the period of recession, depression, right? Growth nahi tha, right? We were having very low growth rate, right? So there was no spending. We had demand deficiency. Demand bhi nahi tha, right? So the inflation was very less, right? Now we come to the period of 1960s. 1960s mein the average inflation rate was 6.4%. And the reason behind that was number one, war, right? So whenever you have war, you need to go ahead and you need to collect food, right? For the people who will be fighting war. You need to go ahead and you need to spend a lot of money on weapons, on food. And then there was drought. So because there was drought, there was less of food available in the economy anyways, right? So supply chain was disrupted, right? So less supply, more demand, automatically there were price shocks in the economy. So the average inflation rate was high. Then we talk about the period of 1970s. But here inflation rate was 9%, right? So during this time, there was global oil crisis. And whenever there is oil crisis in the economy, of course, oil is the source of running all machines. Oil is the source of entire supply chain. So अगर oil expensive होगा, cost of production will increase, and when cost of production will increase, automatically there is going to be increase in the price. Cost push inflation हो जाएगा, right? Then there was a period of 1980s. 1980s is when your inflation rate was 8%, right? There was high expenditure followed by moderate inflation. High expenditure followed by moderate inflation. Then there was 1990s. 1990s was when the inflation was 9.5%, right? You had BOP crisis, right? You wanted to bring a lot of reforms, right? And then you had the period of 2000. 2000 was when the inflation up to 2008. You remember 2008 was the golden period of India till 2008. So the inflation was 3 to 5%, right? And then the inflation started increasing after 2009, and we started talking about something which was called as protein inflation. Maybe you have not heard of it. So what happened during this period is that we had food and fuel prices were increasing. Right? Food and fuel prices were increasing, right? And what we saw during this period is that there was also, you know, we know 2008 period, right? There was global crisis in the economy. So usually that crisis also has an impact, but we'll talk about that in a while. So there was also at the same time Manrega that we had introduced. And when we introduce things like Manrega, where we have to ensure minimum wage, उस wage से कम में काम नहीं होगा, the cost of production shoots up. And when the cost of production shoots up, then the price automatically shoots up, right? Then we also had something which was called as protein inflation, right? We also had something called as protein inflation. So basically, what happened during this period is that we so try to understand, huh? As we proceed towards the path of development, right? We want to go ahead and we want to shift ourselves to better food, like milk, like egg, like meat, like fish, like pulses. And we saw that these foods had a sustained rise in the price, right? So when there was shift in the consumption pattern of India, as the income was increasing, right, especially in the rural area, there was high demand for these foods, and high demand automatically means high price, right? So we saw that the food, apart from food inflation, if I particularly look at the protein goods, right, they had gained a lot of popularity, right? Then in 2010, right, we had inflation which was 6 to 9% from 2011 to 13, and then negative in 2015, right? So here we talk about the global oil and food prices, right, leading to disinflation in the economy, right? And why it happened, I will be writing about that also in detail. Okay. अभी के लिए this is the overall analysis that I want to do. I have not done the analysis, by the way. अभी के लिए मैंने बस लिखा है ये. We need to go ahead and we need to do this analysis in detail, right? So abhi ke liye we are just going ahead and we are just mentioning what phases are there. 1950s mein we had a phase of average 1.7%, 6.4%, 9%, 8%, 9.5%, 3 to 5%, followed by the disinflation. Okay, okay. So let's talk about 1950s in detail now. But the 1950s was a period of low and stable inflation. Okay. India had just got its independence. ठीक है, तो गवर्नमेंट का जो मेन फोकस था वो था कि वी वांट टू डू इकोनॉमिक डेवलपमेंट एंड वी वांट प्राइस स्टेबिलिटी. यहाँ पे एज आई टोल्ड यू द इकोनॉमिक ग्रोथ वाज वेरी मॉडेस्ट, बहुत कम था ग्रोथ, बहुत ज्यादा ग्रोथ नहीं था. बट द spending by government was very limited. There was controlled fiscal spending. ठीक है. So this period of low inflation was a period of controlled growth economy. ठीक है. We were just learning how to grow, right? We were just understanding what to do. And at this period, the government was not spending very much money. We had tight monetary control. Money supply भी बहुत limited था economy में. So the aggregate demand was also limited in the economy. ठीक है. Though Nehru was pushing for the industrial sector during this period, you remember the first and second period, second 5-year plan, Nehru was talking about a lot of investments in the agricultural sector and making India self-dependent and not importing industrial goods from outside. So although these industrial substitution policies were there, right? So still we saw that even if industries would produce something, उसको खरीदने के लिए demand has to come from consumer. And how are these consumers earning money currently? Through agricultural sector. So when the government was not focusing on agricultural sector, the income of consumer was limited. When the income of consumer was limited, The demand of consumer was limited. When the demand of consumer was limited, automatically the prices were low. Because अगर demand ही नहीं होगा, तो you cannot have a lot of supply, right? So this is the period of 1950s. Okay, write it with me. The 1950s was period of low and stable inflation with average of 1.7%. India had achieved its independence in 1947, and government's main focus was on planned economic development and stability, right? This phase had low fiscal spending and strong administration from the government, right? So this period was a low inflation, controlled growth economy. Okay. This was the period where the government had low fiscal deficit. खर्चा बहुत कम था. There were controlled imports, तो demand import wise भी कम थी. Minimum exposure to the price shocks in the world. World में कुछ भी चल रहा हो, India had very less exposure, right? So what were the main causes of low inflation in this period? First, low aggregate demand, right? So industrialization was in the early stage, right? Consumer spending was very limited. Why limited? क्योंकि पैसा ही नहीं था. Consumer didn't have money. Consumers were earning their money through agricultural sector. Government agricultural sector पे focus नहीं कर रही थी. Since government was not focusing on agricultural sector, consumers were having limited income. When consumer were having limited income, consumer का spending limited था. Second, conservative fiscal policy. Government deficit was very modest. ठीक है. Government was only relying mainly on domestic savings and external aid to finance the 5 year plans. ठीक है. बहुत पैसा गवर्नमेंट के पास नहीं था. जो भी सेविंग्स थी और जो भी एक्सटर्नल एड मिल पा रही थी उस पे ही गवर्नमेंट हैड टू गो अहेड एंड हैड टू स्पेंड दैट मनी. So the spending of government was also limited. So the G factor in C plus I plus G plus NX, जब हम aggregate demand निकालते हैं उसमें we find C plus I plus G plus NX, उसमें that G factor, it was very, very less. So aggregate demand was this. C factor was also less, consumption कम था, and the G factor was also less. Third, tight monetary policy. Tight monetary policy. So RBI had a very cautious credit policy. ठीक है. ऐसा नहीं, I mean the money supply was limited. So when money supply is limited, credits are limited. When credits are limited, automatically demand will be limited. So these are the low demand factors. Now let's talk about the supply factors. So from the side of supply, you have agriculture recovery. The first 5-year plan prioritized agriculture. It improved irrigation a bit and it ensured a bit of food security. Not in detail. I mean, then we went on to industry, but still, as compared to the British era, we had a little more food security. Second, price control and rationing. So, because now the government was in control of prices, government could put ceiling on the price, what can be the maximum price in the economy. Third, stable import and external aid. Availability of food imports under the PL 480, it helped ensure that the food was available and therefore the food prices were stable. Okay, so these were the supply side factors. So supply was enough, demand was not enough. Less demand, more supply automatically ensured lower prices in the economy. Now, whatever essential commodities were there, they were usually government regulated and उसमें बहुत ज़्यादा price fluctuation वैसे भी नहीं आ रहा था, right? We know the first 5-year plan focus was on agriculture, irrigation, power, transport, है ना? Government का spending limited था, inflationary pressure limited था. The second 5-year plan, launch of Nehru-Malanobis model, it emphasized on heavy industries. Government investment began to increase, but inflation फिर भी बहुत modest था. Inflation was not increasing a lot, and वो because government spending investment sector में ज़्यादा था, it was not overstimulating the demand, right? So we saw that, as I said, so to summarize all of this, there was large share of population in the agricultural sector. Because of that, they didn't have money. They didn't demand much. Demand nahi tha, price nahi the. Wages were limited. Private consumption limited हो रहा था. Import substitution policies की वजह से, because we had import substitution policies, we were importing less. बाहर का सामान नहीं आ रहा था अंदर. Demand of imported goods was also less. We were less affected by the world prices. Credit creation was tightly monitored by RBI, right? So even when the government started doing some capital expenditure in the second 5-year plan, overall demand pull pressure remained less. Demand pull pressure बहुत ज़्यादा नहीं था, right? So therefore we can say that inflation was low. Okay, this is the first period. Okay, let's talk about the second period. 1960s, Gota. Right. Now, when we talk about the period of 1960s mein basically, as I told you, two main things happened. The first one was war and the second one was drought. Okay. Let's think about this now. So, whenever there is a war, right? The period of war, basically, as I told you, the period of war basically means that government will be spending a lot of money. G factor in C plus I plus G plus NX will be high. There will be high spending done by the government, which will lead to fiscal deficit of government. ये बात समझो पहले. Heavy spending was done on Indo-China war, okay, and Indo-Pakistan war also, right? Because government was spending a lot of money, you have to buy weapons and you have to do things. How will the government finance fiscal deficit? So we have studied in Indian economy कि जब भी fiscal deficit शुरू में होता था, we used to go ahead and we used to finance this fiscal deficit by printing money. हम money print करते थे और उससे इस deficit को finance कर देते थे. So government started printing money to finance this deficit. Deficit was caused because government was spending a lot and spending a lot because there were war. समझ में आती है बात? Because of this now, because the government started printing money, money in circulation started increasing. And we know whenever money is printed, हाँ, तो money loses its value, उतने से inflation आ जाता है. So we saw that inflation started coming in the economy. At the same time, there was also rising population in the economy. Okay, so when population started increasing, we had higher demand. Consumption demand started increasing, especially for food grains. So we saw that that also increased the demand. तो demand pull inflation होना शुरू हो गया. And at the same time, there were droughts. Supply side से देखा जाए. So because there were droughts, these droughts meant that there was less supply of food. The supply less, demand more, prices started increasing. Right? So we'll talk about the causes of inflation now. So प्लीज राइट डाउन बेटा. तो आप देखो कि जब भी हम इन्फ्लेशन की बात करते हैं, हम कॉस्ट पुल और डिमांड पुल दोनों की एक साथ बात करते हैं. दोनों साइड से इन्फ्लेशन आ रहा होता है. राइट. देयर इज सप्लाई शॉक हैपनिंग लाइक ड्रॉट्स. देयर इज डिमांड पुल कंपोनेंट. देयर इज ऑल्सो कॉस्ट पुश कंपोनेंट. ठीक है. ओके, सो राइट डाउन द फैक्टर्स बेटा. रीजंस फॉर इन्फ्लेशन. वन, deficit financing and war expenditure. So I am not writing them in detail, but I want all of you to write these pointers. ये सारे points आप लिखोगे इसके अंदर. हाँ. So in deficit financing, one, there were two wars. एक इंडो चाइना वॉर हुआ था 1962 में. Then there was Indo-Pakistan War 1965 में. And these war meant that the government expenditure increased. And this government expenditure had to be financed by printing of note. Right. And therefore, for this printing of note to finance this government expenditure, there was automatically increase in price of the commodities. Second, expansionary fiscal policy. Expansionary fiscal policy. So the third plan, it emphasized industrialization, large public investments, right? And because of this, because we wanted to do industrialization, we wanted to increase government expenditure, again it led to higher government expenditure. ठीक है. और ये गवर्नमेंट एक्सपेंडिचर ये वाला भी कैसे फाइनेंस हो रहा था? बाय प्रिंटिंग ऑफ नोट. Right. So deficit financing, because of deficit financing, we saw that the inflation was coming in the economy, money was losing its value. Third, population growth. Population was growing at the rate of 2% beta per annum. This was increasing consumption, increasing aggregate demand, increasing the price in the economy. This is the demand side factors. अब थोड़ा supply side factors की बात करते हैं. So first, as I told you, there were droughts, right? So drought and agricultural failure. There were two consecutive monsoon failure. एक 1965 में, एक 1966 में, दो consecutive monsoon failures आए थे, right? So because there were two consecutive monsoon failures, what we saw is that this led to decline in the supply. The supply started declining, right? So agricultural output decreased by nearly 20%. It declined by 20%, right? And because of this, supply less, automatically price will increase. Second is wars and supply bottleneck. अब जब वॉर होगा तो डिस्ट्रप्शन आएगी ट्रांसपोर्ट में, ट्रेड रूट्स में, इंपोर्ट में, सप्लाइंग ऑफ एसेंशियल कमोडिटीज में, क्योंकि आप अपने सारे रिसोर्सेस को रीलोकेट करोगे, रीएलोकेट करोगे टू द डिफेंस सेक्टर, right? And therefore civilian supply will be reduced, right? So supply chain was getting disrupted, due to which there was hoarding, prices were increasing. Third, rupee devaluation in 1966. The rupee was devalued by about 36.5% in 1966. And since this rupee was devalued, इससे क्या हुआ कि devaluation always makes your imports expensive. You remember international economics? Devaluation से exports increase, import decrease, import become expensive. So we saw that because of devaluation, the imports were becoming expensive. And when imports become expensive and you still need those imports, क्योंकि वो essential commodity है, आपको वो चाहिए ही चाहिए. So when imports become expensive, you indirectly take the inflation in the economy, right? You bring inflation in the economy. Fourth, it's a continuation of point 3, import dependence on food. So there was heavy reliance on US PL 480 wheat imports. Okay. And when you saw कि imports expensive हो गए, sometimes the supply was delayed, automatically the domestic prices started increasing. Okay. So there was low agricultural productivity in India, lack of irrigation, food supply was heavily dependent on weather. Okay. There were droughts in India. There was limited storage capacity of India. Distribution capacity affect हो रही थी. Because of all this, we saw that the supply was less. And when the supply of commodities fall, automatically the price starts increasing in the country. Is it clear? So the country saw a mix of cost push inflation, demand pull forces, and certain supply shocks during this period. Okay, is it clear? So this is your period of 1960s. अच्छा, एक चीज इसमें डिस्कस करनी है कि so whenever you see inflation in the economy, how the government responses, वो भी बहुत इंपॉर्टेंट है बेटा कि गवर्नमेंट का क्या रिस्पॉन्स रहा इस पूरे में. So we know that when we talk about the period of 1966 to 69, इसको हमने बोल दिया था planned holiday, right? This was called as planned holiday. Planned holiday माने we understood कि because of the war and drought, whatever we decided in the 5-year plan वो follow नहीं हो पाएगा. So we wanted some break to restore macroeconomic balance, right? We wanted to take some efforts to curb deficit financing. जो हम ये कर रहे थे कि गवर्नमेंट का एक्सपेंडिचर हो रहा था, we were printing notes and doing deficit financing. We wanted some efforts to curb that. We wanted some efforts to stop that somehow, है ना? तो we saw first of all कि government launched planned holidays to curb deficit financing, to depend more, to resolve this problem of dependence on the external sector, to, stabilize the macroeconomic problems that we were facing. Then, during this period, to resolve this inflation, RBI, it tightened the monetary policy. ठीक है, it tightened the amount of credit in the economy. ठीक है, selective credit controls were there. ठीक है, then जो भी hoarding हो रही थी food की, hoarding of food, right, उसको हमने restrain किया. So we understood कि हमें कुछ controls लाने पड़ेंगे to restrain speculative hoarding of food grains, because when you hoard food grains उसका price बढ़ जाएगा, right? Then we devalued rupee, because of which our exports increased and current account balance improved, right? And this devaluation, it helped us to secure World Bank, IMF aid, right? It secured this aid for us, and we launched Green Revolution. In 1966-67 we launched Green Revolution because we knew कि agriculture का productivity बहुत limited है, it is very weather dependent, बहुत droughts आ रहे हैं, it's not able to do well, irrigation facility अच्छा नहीं है. So we wanted to raise the food production and we wanted to ensure long-term price stability. ठीक है. So we went ahead and we launched this agricultural reforms. Is it clear? So whenever you study any period, also study what and how the government improved that situation. वो भी important है. As economic students, you should analyze that situation well. Making sense?